Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, so this is the fourth video in our Derrida series, and we're looking at difference or the trace in relation to Heideggerian being. So this video is going to be a two-part video, a two-part topic, and basically the plan is to start off by looking at Heidegger's being itself, see what Heidegger meant when he talked about being, and just looking at it through the lens of Derrida, so as Derrida describes it. But it's fairly accurate. I agree with everything he says about Heidegger's position on being. And then we'll look at Derrida on being. So what Derrida's criticisms of Heidegger's concept of being. And that is going to take us through to the end of today's video and the beginning of the next video. And then at the end of the next video, I'm going to give my own thoughts about Derrida's criticisms. And that'll take us through two videos of this topic. So let's get into the first section, which is Heideggerian being. So the first thing here that we can look at, this is all from Derrida's essay Difference, and the first thing I have is a quote. Derrida quotes Heidegger from the Anaximander fragment, where Heidegger says the point of being is to be the being of beings, and the first two beings there are capitalized. So the point of capital B being is to be the capital B being of beings. And that last beings then is just begins with a small letter, indicating that there's a difference for Heidegger between capital B being and small b beings. Right? The first is, we'll talk about that in a minute actually, but the idea is that this capital B being is connected to small b beings. It's connected to things, connected to entities, connected to actual things as that by which those beings become the beings that they are. So being for Heidegger has this intrinsic connection to beings. That's the idea. That's what I wanted to point out from that section, from that quote. The second thing is that being is presence for Heidegger. And he says our mistake is to think of it in terms of being present, small b. In other words, our mistake is to think of it as something which is present, a present thing, being present. And what Heidegger is getting at with his capital B being is presence, the idea of presence. So we have this distinction between presence and being present. The former is, again, like that which allows a being to be present. And the being present is just the thing itself. It's almost like a form-content kind of distinction, although not quite. But the small b being is kind of the content. It's the thing itself. Big B being is, while not the form, it's not the content. It's not the thing itself. Rather, it's that which lets that small b being appear, be present. And the name that Heidegger gives to that is presence. So we have that distinction, presence and being present. And this is essentially the ontological difference. So the difference between capital B being, or presence, and small b beings, or present. And then we have this notion of the forgetting of being. And the idea here is that the essence of presence or being Or again, to put it in a different, to use different language there, the difference between being and beings has been forgotten. And that's an important part of Heidegger's philosophy. This distinction, the ontological difference, has been forgotten. However, there is a quote that Derrida presents again from Heidegger in the Anaximander fragment, and it looks like this. The forgetting of being is a part of the very essence of being and is concealed by it. This means the history of being begins by the forgetting of being, in that being retains its essence, its difference from beings. The matinal trace of difference effaces itself from the moment that presence appears as a being present. Okay, so perhaps first up, that word matinal, it's kind of a weird word to throw in, but it just means something like early. And I think the sense there is another word that Heidegger used a lot was primordial or originary. So that's what I think that word is indicating, the originary, the primordial trace of difference effaces itself from the moment that presence appears as being present. Okay, so let's look at this in a bit of detail. First up, it's a very Derridean way of putting it, or rather Derrida perhaps uses a very Heideggerian way of putting it, that he talks about the trace of difference effacing itself. That sounds, I mean, this is all language that Derrida uses, right? Trace, effacing, and obviously difference is a key part. So it's interesting to see the context within which Derrida's thought is kind of playing out. You can see how much he's borrowing, or how much he's carrying on from the people who came before him, in particular, in this case, Heidegger. And we talked about that a couple of videos back. Okay, so a couple of those early points aside, let's look at the meaning of this. So the forgetting of being belongs to the very essence of being. That's the main idea here. And it's thus concealed by it. So what does this mean? Because being, capital B being, as presence itself is never a being present. It's never a being. It's never an actual being, a small b being. And since the forgetting of being is a part of the essence of being, then the forgetting is also never a being present. It's never a small b being. So the forgetting of being, to say that the forgetting of being is concealed by being, just follows from the fact that, as Heidegger is saying, the forgetting of being is a part of the essence of being. And the essence of being is to conceal itself. It must conceal itself in order to let things appear, in order to let things present themselves. Being itself must efface itself. And the forgetting of being, Heidegger is saying, is a part of the essence of being. So it also partakes in this effacing, this self-effacement. So it also conceals itself. And that's why we have that's why Heidegger is saying in this quote that the forgetting of being is concealed, it's effaced. But there's another aspect of this too. So we can ask, what is the mechanism through which being is forgotten? How is it forgotten? And he tells us at the end of that quote there, it's forgotten because it appears as a being present. So he says in that quote, the matinal trace of difference effaces itself from the moment that presence appears as a being present. In other words, as something, as a being. But didn't I just say that being can never be a being present? Yes, that's true. Being is never a being. But we can nevertheless mistakenly think of it as a being present. And when we do that, we cover over the being itself. When we think of being as a being present, when we think of it as something, when we try and understand it in concepts and categories and try to treat it as a thing, then we have covered over presence, being itself. So what do we have in that quote? The maternal trace of difference effaces itself from the moment that presence appears as a being present. The trace of the ontological difference effaces itself by appearing as a being present. But that is a mistake. That's not what it is. And it's that mistake that covers over the essence of being. Okay, so that's the forgetting of being. And then the last thing regarding Heidegger here is the way that the ontological difference appears as trace. The difference between being and beings, however, can in turn be experienced as something forgotten only if it is already discovered with the presence of the present, and if it is thus sealed in a trace that remains preserved in the language which being appropriates. So again, lots of very Derridean flavour to that. We can rediscover the ontological difference as something that has been forgotten by noticing this trace, this hidden residue, if you like, of presence that is, to use Heidegger's word, that's sealed in the language that we use to talk about beings, the language that we use to talk about things. If we look carefully, if we interrogate our language carefully with insight, then we can detect this trace of the ontological difference which has been left behind. So it's been forgotten, but there is a trace which is possible if you read Heidegger, basically. If you read Heidegger and follow his thinking, and then you can detect this essence of being, that which lets beings appear as the beings that they are. Cool, and that kind of brings us up to speed with Heidegger's being. So now we need to look at Derrida on being. So the first thing for Derrida then is that being, that word itself, suggests wholeness or completion. And difference, with an A, for Derrida on the other hand, is rather a rupture with totality. Or another word that he uses, a caesura, that breaks the unity of being by including the other, and difference, bringing that into the source of meaning. So already, just with the word itself, Derrida has a problem here, because it implies something whole. It implies a totality, something complete, and even perhaps something fixed, which is the exact opposite of what Derrida is looking at with his concept of difference with an A. And then secondly, we've got Heidegger's notion of the ontological difference, the difference between presence and being present, capital B being and small b beings. But for Derrida wants to go past that. He wants to go beyond that to see that which makes possible this kind of thinking, the thinking of the ontological difference, what he calls the pre-opening of the ontic ontological difference. So Derrida wants to go beyond the ontological difference to find that which makes difference possible, difference with an E. And that we can take that right back to our definition of difference with an A. Difference with an A is the origin or production of differences with an E, and the differences between differences, all with E's. Or the play of differences, again with an E. So again, there's a sense that Derrida is claiming here Heidegger's too high up. Derrida wants to go beneath Heidegger to uncover how this difference with an E can come about in the first place, this ontological difference that Heidegger's describing. And the next thing we're going to look at is presence. So this is the next big topic here. And Derrida acknowledges that being is not a substance. He also acknowledges that it's not connected with the logos, i.e. voice or speech, which is for Derrida irrevocably and fully present. So that's not going to work for Derrida. It's too open, it's too direct, and we're trying to understand how that thing can be so open, so direct, so present. So it's not going to work with if there's anything in any way connected with logos, but that's okay because, like I say, Derrida acknowledges being is not connected with the logos. Being, Derrida says, is silent, mute, insonorous, wordless, originally aphonic. That's from of Grammatology. So he's acknowledging that's fine. And also being is not transcendental. So he says that for Heidegger, the sense of being is never simple and rigorously signified. So it's not a part of signification. It's not a sign indicating something outside of our regular language, for example. It's not a sign indicating something transcendental, a meaning that is outside of the sphere of our language or our understandings. And he says that it's not by chance that Heidegger doesn't use the word transcendental. So being for Derrida, when he's thinking about Heidegger, escapes the movement of the sign. So it avoids this trap of signification where and we'll talk about signification a little bit later, but that the idea that every sign refers to every signifier refers to a certain fixed signified. So he escapes that problem, so that's good. So being is not any of those things, not substance, not connected with the logos, and is not transcendental. However, Derrida says that despite all of this, being is still thought in positive terms as presence. And we saw that when in a lot of the quotes or the way I described being in the first part, it is presence for Heidegger. It's presence as opposed to being present. And Derrida has a problem with this. The ontology of presence is the ontology of beings and beingness. What is questioned by the thought of difference, therefore, is the determination of being in presence or in beingness. The first consequence of this is that difference is not. It is not a being present, however excellent, unique, principal, or transcendent one makes it. So for Derrida, then, difference with an A is questioning the whole notion of presence as originary. And as we've seen, this is exactly how being appears in Heidegger, that the distinction, being and being present. So Derrida is really honing in on this word presence and what it implies. As he says, the ontology of presence is the ontology of beings and beingness. But he wants to go past that to the determination of being in presence or in beingness. And this means that, as we've seen already in prior videos, difference with an A is not. So that's its, instead of presence, difference is not. It isn't. It can't be described as is, because it isn't anything. Though this type of language, the language of presence, just doesn't work here for Derrida. But we've said it's not, difference is not, we've said it's not presence, but it also isn't absence for Derrida. And this is an important point. In this way, we question the authority of presence or its simple symmetrical contrary, absence or lack. We thus interrogate the limit that has always constrained us, that always constrains us, we who inhabit a language and a system of thought, to form the sense of being in general as presence or absence, in the categories of being or beingness. So, not absence either. Presence and absence are both, they belong together, and they're only thinkable in relation to each other. And in fact, both of these terms, presence and absence, belong to the same metaphysics, which is represented by Heidegger as being or beingness. And it's precisely this that Derrida is trying to go beyond, this idea of that pairing. Any kind of pairing is already buying into a certain metaphysical picture, and in this case, it's the presence absence description, the way of thinking. So, being is or difference with an A isn't presence, but it also isn't absence, because it just goes beyond our capacity to describe it in language, in words. And this is the problem that Derrida has with Heidegger's formulation of being as presence. Okay, so this brings us to the final part of today's video, the forgetting of being and trace. So what does Derrida have to say about this? Well, first let's begin with what has been forgotten for Derrida, and what's been forgotten, he says, is the trace's trace. Let's explain that. What Heidegger wants to point out is that the difference between being and beings, forgotten by metaphysics, has disappeared without leaving a trace. The very trace of difference has sunk from sight. If we admit that difference is itself something other than presence and absence, if it traces, then we are dealing with the forgetting of the difference between being and beings. And we now have to talk about a disappearance of the trace's trace. So, okay, what has been forgotten here, what has disappeared without leaving a trace, is the ontological difference, the distinction between being and being present, or presence and being present. But the ontological difference is neither presence nor absence. Rather, it traces, Derrida says. But what does it trace? Or, equivalently, what is it a trace of? And the answer to that is difference, difference with an A, or the trace. Remember that we talked about the way that the trace and difference with an A are essentially the same thing, or different aspects of the same thing. So difference with an A has been traced, or the trace has been traced. So the ontological difference is then a trace of the trace. That's kind of one way to think about this. So what has been forgotten, or what has disappeared, is the trace of the trace. That's how I pass this this idea anyway, that what's been forgotten for Derrida is the trace's trace, just going one step down, one step lower, one step further than Heidegger did. It's not just that the ontological difference has been forgotten, because the ontological difference itself points to this deeper difference with an A, or the trace. It's kind of like a two-step process, if you like. The what's been forgotten is kind of buried, twice removed. But Derrida is even going to go further than this and say that even the loss of the trace's trace has been itself forgotten. The matinal trace of difference is lost in an irretrievable invisibility, and yet even its loss is covered, preserved, regarded, and retarded. This happens in a text in the form of presence. So here then, the trace of the trace, which is the ontological difference, is lost, is forgotten, but even this loss is then covered over. It's covered, there, as Derrida says, covered, preserved, regarded, and retarded. And I think what all of those words, we can take each one separately because they describe a different aspect of this covering over, or this hiddenness. And that's the first one, actually, covered. If the loss has been covered, it's been hidden. The loss has been preserved, it's retained, but beneath our awareness. So it's still there, but it's so deep down, it's so buried, as we saw, that there's already a two-step process and then this extra layer on top of it. So it's there, but it's so far down that we have no inkling that it's there. The third word he uses is regarded, and I think here this is a little bit difficult, but the way I understand it, he means it's become a function in a referential structure. So it's been taken up, the trace of the trace, this forgetting of the trace has been absorbed, and it's become part of the way that we think and the way that we talk, such that we don't recognize it anymore. And then finally, retarded, which I think matches fairly nicely with the idea of delay. So it's been delayed indefinitely. But then we can ask, why take this extra step? What's the difference between forgetting the trace's trace and the loss of this forgetting? Why take that extra step? In the former, just the forgetting of the trace's trace, the ontological difference might conceivably remain in some semi-overt sense. For example, that's that inkling that something something's missing, you might have a sense that something's not quite right, that there is something that there is something deeper here. But in the latter, where even that forgetting has been lost, has been covered, preserved, regarded, and retarded, even that possibility of this inkling that there's something that you're missing, even that has been wiped away, been effaced. So it's just a deeper sense of the hiddenness of, well, difference with an A for Derrida, or being, capital B, being for Heidegger, which then begs the question: how is Derrida able to uncover it? And the idea is that, I guess, it's not easy, and it's not even apparent. So it's not even so he faces so much criticism and resistance to his idea, because we don't think there's anything wrong. We don't recognize that there is anything missing, but it's nevertheless possible to make this case, even though we don't have that sense that there is something missing. So despite that, Derrida was still able to formulate this picture of difference with an A, to go down the layers and give us what he thinks is this originary picture. But even without this sense that something's missing, because it has been so completely covered, preserved, regarded, and retarded. Okay, so that's the loss and the forgottenness of the trace in difference with an A. But we can still go a little bit further as well and ask how this loss happens. How is the trace's trace and our forgetting of it so effectively and completely covered? And the answer is in a text. In the end of that quote, Derrida says it happens in a text in the form of presence. This metaphysical text must have retained a mark of what it lost or put in reserve, set aside. The present becomes the sign of signs, the trace of traces. It is no longer what every reference refers to in the last instance. It becomes a function in a generalized referential structure. So the disappearance or the forgetting of the trace's trace is lost in a metaphysical text in the form of presence. And a metaphysical text, then, obviously this is not a book or writing. Derrida is talking about the text of Western metaphysics. And it's been forgotten, or it's been covered over in the form of presence. So appearing as a positive thing, as something like presence, something which has this plenitude, this positivity associated with it, something that we can grasp with our concepts, that we can fix and think about and fit into a metaphysical picture. So presence then, rather than merely meaning the appearing of a thing for Derrida, becomes the sign of signs or the trace of traces, because it indicates difference with an A. If you're able to penetrate these layers of forgottenness and these layers of forgetting and loss, essentially, difference with an A, then, it's hidden in plain sight. It's hidden by the fact that it becomes represented as in presence. when it becomes represented as something, when it takes on positivity, a positive fullness within a metaphysical picture, then it's been perfectly covered over. But that presence itself is the key for Derrida. That presence is what we need to break through those layers of forgetting and loss, and then uncover difference with an A. And that's what Derrida has done, and that's what he's telling us we should follow him in thinking. So what about the trace itself? The trace is not a presence, but is rather the simulacrum of a presence that dislocates, displaces, and refers beyond itself. The trace has, properly speaking, no place, for effacement belongs to the very structure of the trace. So what's one thing that's important in that quote, I think, is the use of Derrida's use of the word A, or the letter A, when he says the trace is not a presence. It's not a presence because it doesn't appear as a thing, i.e. it doesn't become present. Trace is that in which other things become present. Remember, it's difference with an A, so it's right at the bottom here. It's at that ground level whereby things become present. So it's not a presence, but it appears to be present when we label it as such, when we think about it the way that we've typically thought about it. But this then is, in actual fact, Derrida is saying, this appearance of presence is actually only a simulacrum of presence, because there is nothing there. There is nothing in the trace. The trace is nothing itself. But it's not to say that it is nothing, because already then we're playing back into that metaphysical game, the opposites, is and to be and to not be, to is and is not, presence and absence. The trace is always by its very nature effaced. And I think that word simulacrum is quite important, because that's another word that gets used by everybody around this time. Deleuze uses it, and obviously it comes down through people like Baudrillard as well. But yeah, this is just placing us right into the midst of all of these thinkers and the way that they thought about this stuff. Okay, so I'm going to finish up here, and we've kind of, the idea with this video is that we've looked at Heidegger's account of being, and I've tried to kind of match Derrida's criticisms of being through the same kind of topics, and I think that'll be clearer when we look at the summary, which we'll do now, actually. So first up was Heideggerian being, and we started with being as the being of beings. So it's that which makes the beings that they are. Another key point here was the ontological difference, so the distinction between presence and being present, or capital B being and small b beings. Then we looked at also the forgetting of being, so the way that for Heidegger the ontological difference is forgotten, but since this forgetting belongs to the essence of being, it's always concealed by it. So it's always concealed in the way that it always appears as a being present. It appears as a particular being. And finally, the trace. So even Heidegger talks about the trace. There's something, a residue, there's something left behind in the presence of the present, which indicates this ontological difference. And that's what Heidegger used to go beyond simply simple things, simple beings, to this deeper notion of being itself. Then we looked at Derrida on being. And the first problem he had is that being suggests wholeness or completion, whereas difference with an A is a rupture with totality. Then we looked at the ontological difference, and Derrida's point here is that difference with an A is that which makes difference with an E possible. That pre-opening of the ontological difference. So just trying to go deeper to uncover. Heidegger, with the notion of the ontological difference, Derrida is saying, is already too high. He's already at the level of difference with an E, but that's not deep enough. He wants to uncover difference with an A, that which makes those differences with E's possible. Then we looked at being as thought in terms of presence. And this was a problem for Derrida, because obviously everything about Derrida is a resistance to this notion of presence. And to equate being with presence is to really get off on the wrong foot for him. But in actual fact, Derrida will go on and say that difference isn't presence or absence. So we're just going beyond these metaphysical categories, these categories that really only make sense in relation to each other. And again, if we're at that level, this is a level too high for where Derrida wants to go. And then we looked at the forgetting of being. And this was kind of a tricky section, but the idea here is that we've got the forgetting of the ontological difference. That was how Heidegger characterized it. And Derrida wants to say, however, that what he's dealing with is the forgetting of the loss of the trace's trace. So this is very much, we could say it's an extension maybe of Heidegger, or perhaps even a reformulation. So he's going beyond where he thinks Heidegger was, and changing all of the terms as well. So we're not talking about being anymore. We're talking about the trace. And he's going further than Heidegger, because what's been forgotten is not just the ontological difference, because the ontological difference itself is a trace for Derrida. What's been forgotten then is the trace of the trace. But it's not just that either, because that has also been lost. That's also been forgotten. So there's that double movement, that double forgetting, if you like. The forgetting of the loss of the ontological difference, or the trace's trace. And then there's another aspect of this, the way that the loss occurs in the form of presence. And this is kind of not just extending Heidegger, although Heidegger says something similar, but it's a stronger reworking, I think, of Heidegger. Because what we have now is presence as the sign of signs, or the trace of traces. And it's almost like it's the ultimate sign, because it indicates difference with an A. It is the fact that something is present, or the fact of presence, is what we need to go beneath it, to uncover difference with an A. Although it's not apparent. It's not apparent that anything's missing. And so no one's talked about it until Derrida would say. But yeah, once you get that, once you have presence, if you can think of it in the way that Derrida thinks of it, it appears as this ultimate sign, this this sign which points to difference with an A. And then we looked at the trace. This is really, for Heidegger, this is a being present that points to being itself, or the ontological difference. And Derrida is saying, however, it's actually the simulacrum of a presence, because it's not actually presence at all. It is not, remember, it appears as something, but that appearance is an illusion. In actual fact, it dislocates, displaces, refers beyond itself. So, whereas for Heidegger, the trace was presence, for Derrida, it's actually the simulacrum of a presence. It's a dislocating, displacing illusion of presence. Okay, and that is where I'm going to wrap up today. In the next video, we've got a couple of points that I want to add to Derrida's critique of Heidegger and his being, and then I'll kind of do some of my own critical reflecting on Derrida's criticisms of being. But that's us for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.